You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved one about the Casanova killer. This is also a case that poses the question, was it connected to O.J. Simpson? Now, a man was able to con his way into the hearts of women across the United States. No one knew he was a killer, except his family. Then when investigators began to figure it out, he became a pro at disappearing. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. It basically just helps push the video through the algorithm, which makes it go to more people, and the victim stories are heard by a broader audience. But I also want to thank all of you who have been purchasing the merch. You look so amazing in it, and I'm so thankful that you guys have been buying it. It really does just make my heart so happy. So if you still want to get it, they are still available. You can ask for it for Christmas. You can ask for it just for a cuddly winter outfit because they are so soft and cozy, but you mean the world to me. And if you want your photo here, all you have to do is tag me on Instagram with a picture that you took. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1995 in Van Nuys, California, and a 34-year-old woman named Sandra Gallagher was a wife and a mother of 3. She was having the best of luck on September 28th. She had actually won some money in the lottery. It was about $1,200, and so she decided that because she was having such a good day and had earned some money, she was going to go to the bar that night and just kind of celebrate. And this meant a lot to her. She was really happy that everybody gets excited when you win free money. And so she decided to treat herself a little bit. She ended up going to a local bar called McRed's and having something to drink. But that would be the last time her husband and children would see her. After this, she didn't come home, but she would soon be found. Her truck was actually one that caught on fire in a parking lot, and she was still inside. Thankfully, there was a witness to this, and this was basically the parking lot of a medical building, possibly a hospital, and a nurse was going in for her morning shift, so it was still kind of dark outside, and she noticed that this truck was parked there, and she had never seen it before, but then she noticed that it had caught on fire. She also witnessed a man, or what she thought to be a man as far as the build, with long hair running from the scene, but his back was to her and she couldn't see his face. When investigators got there and an arson team was brought in, they found that the truck had been set on fire by an accelerant that caused the truck to burn quickly. This also meant that someone had caused the fire. It hadn't just happened because of the truck. Now, they also did an autopsy on Sandra and found that she hadn't been killed by this fire. She had been strangled to death. And unfortunately, there was not a lot of evidence of this murder left behind because of the fire. Her husband was the first to be located, and he was brought in to confirm that the belongings found in the truck did belong to Sandra. But that wasn't the only reason he was brought in. Fingers were quickly pointing at him as the killer, and that is because, in most times when a wife or a husband is killed, their spouse is looked at first to make sure they did not do it. Now, investigators learned that they were having trouble in their marriage, and actually the last few days before her murder, they had been staying apart from one another. But he said that the day she disappeared, earlier that day, they had had lunch together to try to basically reconnect and reform this bond that they had. He said that the lunch went well, and they had a few arguments, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And then later that night, Sandra called him from the McRed's bar and told him that she had won money in the lottery. She was so excited, she was having a good time, and she hung up. And then after that, her husband Steven said he didn't know what happened. to Sandra. Investigators couldn't be sure he was telling the truth, that he didn't kill his wife, but they now had a lead as far as the McRed's bar, and this was the only lead that they really had. So they ended up going there, and the bartender, as well as a few customers who had been there the night she was murdered, were talked to, and they all said that they knew Sandra well. She came to the bar all the time, and she was there talking to a man who was not her husband. Most witnesses said that that night Sandra was talking to this man who had long blonde hair and a beard. They said that they had seen him around the bar the last few days, but he hadn't been known to frequent the bar before then. He was basically loved by everyone there, though, because he was paying for everybody's drinks with his cash, and so of course people were going to love him. That's when staff at the bar said that they witnessed this man ask Sandra for a ride home, saying he lived nearby, and Sandra agreed to take him there, but after that, no one saw her again. They did, however, have a name to provide to investigators: Glen Rogers. But with a little hope that this man had actually used his real name, investigators plugged it into their database. And to their surprise, it came up with an actual man who had long blonde hair and a beard. And it said he lived near the bar in the same area. Now they had a real picture of him and not just a sketch, and they believed that they were going to catch a killer quickly. So they went to his apartment, they stormed the place, but there was no sign of him. There was, however, an earring that Stephen confirmed belonged to Sandra. It was a gift that he had given her. Because the killer wasn't caught, they feared that this would happen again, and they were right. Glen Rogers was registered as a wanted man, but he was long gone by then. However, investigators had talked to Glen's current co-workers and told them to call the police anytime he contacted them again. All his coworkers knew about him was that he sometimes had a bad temper, but a few days later, investigators would get a big tip from these coworkers, and that was that the coworker claimed that Glen had called them from a motel in Jacksonville, Mississippi. And the local police in Jacksonville immediately headed to this motel and asked if Glen Rogers was staying there, and he was. They gave the investigators the room key, and they went and stormed this room, but again, he was long gone. This is when they started to find that Glen was a professional at disappearing, and that he didn't care whether they had his face or his name. He was going to continue doing what he wanted to do, which was to kill. The body would be found in the same area where Glen was said to make this phone call from on November 3rd. This woman was Linda Price, who was 34 years old and a mother to 2 children, an 18-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter. She was always known to be very happy and loved by everyone. Now, she was missing for 3 days by this point, and no one knew where she had gone or why they hadn't seen her. Her sister was said to have plans to go on a Halloween trip with her, trick-or-treating with the kids, but when she arrived at her apartment that day, Linda didn't answer the door and didn't respond at all. Due to this, investigators were called, and Linda was found in her own bathtub, stabbed several times with her throat slashed. Now, there was no sign of forced entry, and so investigators believed that this was possibly someone who knew Linda, who Linda allowed in her home. Her sister then came forward saying that she had met a man at the Mississippi State Fair where, the beer stand was, and they were getting drinks, and this man came up to her and touched her hair and said it was the prettiest red hair he had ever seen. Linda was completely smitten after this point, asked her sister if she thought that he was good looking, and her sister said, yeah, he's good looking, and that is when they started having basically dates and a relationship, and 3 days later they were moving into an apartment together. His name was Glen Rogers. Her family knew his name, and they also had it written on a piece of paper that Linda had written out about her Christmas list, and on the top was Glen. She wanted Glen for Christmas. Linda's mother said that Linda would come to her saying that Glen kind of had a temper and mood swings, and her sister once was over at her house and they basically went to the bathroom together to get away from him, and Linda started telling her that if anything happened to her, to not let Glen get away with it. Linda's mother had them over for dinner at one point and said that Glen was very charismatic, the type of person who could fool you. He would even tell her mother things like she was the best mother and he wished his mother was more like her. This was the first hint at a motive the investigators had gotten. Plugging his name into the database, Jacksonville police then found out why his name sounds so familiar, and they immediately realized that this man had killed 2 different women in 2 different states. They were both redheads with children, and it appeared as though this was his MO. But he had disappeared once again. The public were at this point more involved because they were asked to help locate this killer, and they knew that he was still on the loose, but nobody was really spotting him. Then it was November 7th, only 4 days later, and the Tampa police were called because a maid in Tampa, Florida had gone to room 119 and found a body. This body was in the bathtub and it had stab wounds in the chest and in the bottom. Both were done from behind. Her belongings were scattered all over the room and a men's watch was found underneath her body. She also had red hair and an identifying tattoo of a cross on her shoulder. This maid was spoken to and said that she hadn't cleaned this room in 2 days because the day prior there was a do not disturb sign on the doorknob. This wasn't the usual, hotel made sign that you could put up. It was a handmade sign out of a phone book page that was handwritten. But she went ahead and did not disturb them and decided to go back the next day. But the next day, the sign was still up, nobody was responding, and they were supposed to be checking out that day. So she went ahead and went inside to clean because new people were going to be going into that bedroom at one point. And that is when she found the body. The receptionist told investigators that a man had come in and paid for 1 night on November 5th. But then, the day prior to the woman being found, he came back into the lobby and asked for another night. But when he was given that other night, they then saw the same man packing up his white Ford Festiva like he was going to be leaving, and they went outside to tell him that basically there were lots of robberies happening and to not leave his belongings in the car, and he said everything was fine. The man who had checked in was none other than Glen Rogers, who once again used his real name. Now, the 3rd murder victim had been found and identified as Tina Marie Cribbs, who was a 33-year-old hotel worker and mother of 2. She was identified by her own mother, who said that she had been missing for 2 days. And her car was as well. There was a white Ford Festiva. Her mother claimed that the time that she disappeared, or the day she disappeared, she was going to meet Tina at a local bar, but Tina never arrived. Now, since this matched Glen's MO of where he met the women that he killed, they decided to go to this local bar and talk to the bartenders to see if this murder victim and killer were there. The Showtown bartender knew exactly who Tina was. It was a very friendly, hometown bar, and they said that there was a man who matched Glen's description there who asked her for a ride, and she said she would be right back to meet her mother. However, she didn't come back, and she was never able to. This wouldn't be the end of Tina's case, though, because a few days after, her license and her wallet was found at a rest stop in North Florida, and the fingerprints found on it matched Glen. That was the thing. Investigators had no problem matching Glen to the murder victims, to the crime scenes. He was cocky and unafraid, but somehow reckless and still free. And they had no idea how he was doing it. Investigators speculated that he had fled to another state as he normally did after a kill. They broadcasted his name and image all over the United States to make sure that women were aware that he was out and about and looking for another victim. It was said he was very dangerous and to not go up to him if you saw him, but to call the police. He was being referred to as the Casanova killer or the cross country killer. That's when they believed they had gotten a lucky break, because they had gotten a huge tip saying that Glen was at a motel in Jackson, Mississippi, and because he frequented motels, they thought that this was a perfect place for him to be. In fact, it had been a place that he had already killed. So they rushed to the scene and found a long, blonde-haired guy with a beard. Except this wasn't Glen Rogers. 2 days after Tina's body was found, a woman named Teresa would call the police in Bossier City, Louisiana. She claimed that she had just found her roommate deceased. Now, this roommate wasn't just her roommate, it was her family, her best friend. This woman was named Andy Giles Sutton. She was a 37-year-old redheaded mother of 4. And she had met Teresa at a bar. They kind of bonded together and really supported one another. And Teresa said that Andy helped lift her out of a really bad depression, and the two quickly became like sisters. Andy moved into her apartment, which only had 1 bedroom, but Teresa said she didn't care because she often slept on the couch because she would get home late being a waitress and just sleep on the couch anyway, so Andy got the bedroom. That's also why she didn't immediately find Andy, because when she came home the night prior, it was the middle of the night. She saw the blankets on the couch. She just went and got on the couch and was going to sleep. I mean, the door had been shut and she figured that it was just Andy and her new boyfriend in there, so she didn't even think about it and she decided to go to sleep. But then she was woken up about 10 a.m. the next morning by bangs on the door. She went to open it and it was Andy's ex-boyfriend. And he wanted to see her, and so knowing that Andy had another guy over, she decided to tell him to stay there. She went and knocked on Andy's door to try to get her up and out to go see her ex. And that is when she knocked and Andy wasn't responding. So finally she decided to go in, and she saw a wadded mess of sheets on the bed like someone was in a burrito. And Teresa tried nudging the blankets, but Andy still wasn't responding, and that's when she pulled them back and saw that Andy was dead. She said that Andy had a look of excruciating pain on her face, and immediately Teresa knew who had done this because she had had a horrible feeling about Andy's new boyfriend. You see, a man named Glen Rogers had come into their life prior to that night, actually a little while beforehand, and they had met him at a bar, and Andy was immediately smitten. After the 3 hung out for a while, Andy was telling her that she thought that she loved this Glen guy, and she wasn't one who said that she loved people a lot, according to Teresa. He didn't stay long though. In fact, it was only that night, and then they took him to a bus station where he said he was going to go pick up a car. But strangely enough, he looked at Teresa before he left and told her to take care of his girl, Andy. Teresa said that this was in a very cold voice, and then after that he was gone. But little did they know, that night they had escaped a killer. He was going to pick up a car in Florida, but to do that he was going to have to kill. And that was Tina Marie Cripps, that he killed and then stole her car. After he killed Tina, he took her car and went back to Andy. And Andy was so excited to see him. She had told Teresa that her baby was back, but unfortunately she would not escape a killer this time, and investigators found a huge butcher knife under a pile of clothes in her bedroom, and Andy had been stabbed multiple times. When investigators spoke to neighbors, they said that they had seen Glen leave in a white Ford Festiva. So what caused Glen to do these monstrous things? How did he turn out like this? That's what investigators were trying to figure out, and while doing so, they began to realize that there may just be more murder victims. You see, Glen Rogers had been born on July 15, 1962 in Hamilton, Ohio. He was the 6th and 2nd youngest kid to Edna and Claude, his parents. Now, it turned out that prior to having Glen, his mother Edna tried to get her tubes tied. But because at this time you had to go to a judge and ask if you could do this, the judge said no, that her life wasn't at risk and her tubes were not going to be tied. Right after that, she got pregnant with Glen, who then became a serial killer. Claude was in the military prior to meeting Edna. She was a very, proper church-going gal, but that kind of stopped after she met Claude, who kind of changed her a little bit. As they began to have kids, Claude was working as a pump operator for the Champion Proper Company. Edna stayed home with the children as per Claude's request, and unfortunately after this, Claude began to drink an awful lot. and when he drank, he got angry. This anger was taking out on Edna and sometimes the kids, and it would eventually make him lose his job. Now, according to his siblings, which we know a lot of information from a documentary called My Brother the Serial Killer, which I'll have linked down below, and they said that Glen, as a baby, was a very sweet and normal kid. As he grew older, though, he joined his siblings in stealing food from the neighborhood houses because they were on basically government oatmeal and they didn't have a lot of money for food, so if they were hungry, they had to steal the food. But this escalated to full-on burglary. Problem was, since they were kids, the cops, even if they caught them, wouldn't punish them at all. They would give them food and then basically talk with them and then let them go. So they started not to respect the police, and they believed that they could get away with anything. At 9 years old, Glen was getting really brave. He was walking into houses on his own, stealing whatever he wanted, and coming back out. He had no remorse for what he was doing. It was normal for him. Before he was even 16 years old, he was expelled from junior high, and he wasn't known as a sweet kid anymore. He was known as a sharp-dressed, smooth talker who could basically get what he wanted and was always getting in trouble but never being punished for it. He had also once mentioned by this point that he had a demon living inside of him. In this area where they lived, 100 burglaries had occurred in 90 days, and the fingers started to point at the Rogers family. Now, this was mostly Clay, who was his older brother, and Glen. And Clay and Glen got in trouble, and Clay was sent to reformatory school since he was older, and Glen was sent to basically a youth detention center. Unfortunately, his behavior after this would only get worse, and it was said that while he was there, he was sexually assaulted. When he got out, he was known to go into trance-like states where he would get super violent out of nowhere, and you could not stop him from doing so, and he was actually indicted on drug charges with 21 different people, but all the charges against him were dropped. After this, his brother Clay said he really believed he could get away with anything, and he began to work for the police as an informant for the narcotics unit, and he was learning so many different things. Little did police know that they were training him for what he would do in the future and how to get away with it. This was around the time that his prior girlfriend Deborah had a baby. This baby was from another man, but she was in the hospital after giving birth and had nowhere to go because this man had left her. And because of this, the hospital staff wouldn't allow her to leave with the baby until she had somewhere to go, and that is when Glen offered for her to come home with him. He eventually adopted this baby, and they got married and had another child of their own. This marriage lasted for 2 years and ended horribly. It turned out that Glen was a lot like his father, and he didn't have to be drinking to get as angry as his father did. He didn't trust a thing that Deborah did or said, and always basically micromanaged her life, didn't let her leave for more than like an hour. She would go to the store and he would wonder where she was, and one day he ended up beating her so badly she was sent to the hospital, and she began to say that her husband would beat her up, would lock her in a closet, and would make her starve. And there was also a time when he kicked her so hard with steel boots that there was so much dried blood in her pants that the paramedics had to cut them off. Glen had also tattooed her name on his knuckles and would use that hand to hit her. Thankfully, Deborah did get away, divorced him, and got custody of the kids, but her husband couldn't be charged because he had disappeared. They didn't know at this time that he had gone all the way to California, married another woman named Kathy, and had a child with her. Their marriage didn't last either, and he went on, and that is when he found out that his father Claude had also passed away. This was said to be where Glen really broke down, and after this he began to travel all around the states looking for sex workers. He would live with them after forcing them to allow him in, and then he would take all of their money. If they didn't agree, he would beat them just like he beat his wives. He once got in a relationship with a bartender named Mariah in Los Angeles, and he didn't just beat her up. He beat up her 2 young sons as well, and he went to talk to her at a bar that she worked at and began to yell at her. And thankfully, Mariah's friend Paula stood up for her and told Glen to calm down. and that is when Glen basically threw her across the bar, running up to her with his hands and fists like he was going to punch her. Paula's fight or flight kicked in at this point, and she started screaming at him, and that is when she realized that he basically cowered back and started blubbering like a little boy, like he was afraid of her. He moved on and met a girl named Cora in 1990 that he got into a relationship with. He was 28 by this point, and after beating Cora so much, she finally had enough of it, and she started to fight back. One night she picked up a knife and stabbed him in the elbow. He fled, but then he came back and started beating her once again. When the police were called, he actually used a blowtorch to keep them back. When he was finally arrested, he was put in jail for 3 months. For the next few years, he traveled around getting money by hurting women and conning them. Most of the money would be spent on drugs, and he would go back to Kentucky every once in a while to see his family, and his family weren't the most receptive to having him there because they knew that he would bring them trouble. A newspaper article in their hometown came out about a man who had robbed a convenience store with a butcher knife, and the sketch looked exactly like Glen, except for they knew that he had done this because Glen had brought this money back to his sister, who was about to be evicted from her home. He was on the move once again after this, and his brother, his older brother Clay that we talked about before, he got out of prison at this point and joined him on this road trip, and that is when Clay said he started noticing that Glen was talking about sticking people, basically stabbing them with a knife, and every time when Clay said, "No, you're not going to do that," Glen said that he already had. He'd done it many times and gotten away with it. Clay said he thought that Glen was joking until one night he came back into their hotel room they were sharing covered in blood. Shortly after, Clay went in a different direction than his brother and settled down and got a job. However, his brother wasn't just going to leave him alone, and Clay said that Glen began to show up at his apartment, make him come downstairs and look into his trunk where he would have dead bodies of women. Clay said that this happened several times until Clay went back to prison for an unknown reason and got away from his brother, but Glen was still free to kill. By 1994, Glen was staying in a cabin in Beattyville, Kentucky, which was around his hometown, and the man who had offered him this place to stay was a friend of his mother's, and he had also been missing for a year now. His guns, his car, his coin collection had all been missing as well, and Glen's family feared the worst, knowing how Glen was, but they had no proof until Clay got out of prison again. And he went back to the family cabin, which was a different cabin than the one he was staying in. This family cabin, which was mostly for storage and kind of run down, but Clay needed a place to stay, and he also wanted to get a few items, so he started going through things because there was furniture stacked up everywhere, and that's when he noticed an arm. A human arm. Human remains were bound to a chair under a whole bunch of furniture amongst the mess. And Clay knew that Glen had done this because their father's shot glass was stuck to the wall, kind of like a message to everybody that he had done it. Clay knew that this was the missing man and Glen's basically landlord. I mean, he was living with the guy, but he was Mark Peters, and Clay knew him well. He was a lovely 70-year-old man who was an electrician, a retired one, and a veteran. And he allowed Glen to stay in his home for free as a favor for his mother, Edna. And instead of being appreciative, Glen killed him without mercy. At this point, Clay had a tough decision to make, is what he said. It was either to turn his brother in or pretend he never saw the body. He quickly realized, though, that he wasn't turning in his brother. He was turning in a serial killer. Because, as you remember, this wasn't the first body that Clay knew about. He went to investigators and he told them what he had found, and by the time they identified Mark as the body and coined Glen as a suspect, he was gone. It seemed as though killing and running away started long before anyone believed, because it would be 2 years before Sandra, who we believed to be his first murder victim, was killed. So the scary question was, were there more victims? And how many? Well, the answer might just have been in an extremely high-profile case that nobody looked Glen's way at all for. And it's one you might know of. Because in those 2 years where Mark was found and then the first murder victim of Glen was found, Glen was free to do whatever he wanted, and everyone knew he didn't make the best decisions. He was said to be traveling once again, and it brought him to LA, where he stayed for a while. He began to tell his sister that he was partying with rich and famous people, and he met this beautiful girl named Nicole. He said that she looked like his daughter, and he claimed to be working for Nicole as well, doing maintenance for her home as well as painting, and that was what he was doing around LA at the time. But he told his brother Clay he had different intentions, and this was that Glen knew that Nicole had lots of money, and he was going to take her down. Then, shortly after in LA, news broke that a Nicole had been brutally murdered. This was Nicole Brown Simpson. It was also her friend Ron Goldman as well. This is a case that intrigued many, as Nicole's ex-husband O.J. Simpson, who was a famous football player, was arrested for their murders. However, Glen's family never believed that O.J. had done it. Now, since this is such a controversial case, I want to tell you that everything I'm talking about is simply a theory coming from Glen's family. This is what they believe actually happened. However, I know that there is a lot of other evidence pointing towards OJ, and we'll get into my opinions towards the end, but the Rogers family had made their beliefs very known, and they have explained what they think happened in a documentary that we talked about before, My Brother the Serial Killer. And so that's what I'm going to be discussing with you first. So even though OJ was known to be physically abusive towards his ex, as well as making death threats, stalking her, the Rogers family claimed that he didn't do the actual killing. They believed that OJ hired Glen to actually commit the murder of his ex-wife to keep his own hands clean. Now, even the defense during OJ's trial came across a witness named Tom Lang, who was a neighbor of Nicole's, who said that around the time of the murder, he had seen Nicole at her gate talking to a man who was in a very angry stance, and he said this man was either white, Asian, or Hispanic, but definitely not black like OJ. He also saw a white Ford F-350 parked at the curb like it belonged to this man. Nicole and him locked eyes, but he walked away. Not only was Glen said to be a friend of Nicole's and would often party with her, he also worked doing painting and maintenance jobs, and he had access to a white Ford F-350 to do those jobs. There were also 2 sets of shoe prints found at OJ's trial, and one they believed to match OJ and the other was an unknown person. The Rogers family wondered if possibly Glen had finished the job and OJ wanted to make sure that he had done it so quickly and efficiently like he said. And also, one of Glen's later victims, Linda Price, her family members said that Glen was always talking about being friends with Nicole Simpson, and they didn't believe him. Glen's family said that they had no idea that there would be more victims or that there would be more evidence to connect him to Nicole, until his sister received a call from him one night, and he was manically laughing, saying that he was slapping the bottoms of dead women. He confessed to her that his victim count was up to 70 women, but at this point in the case, this man was being put on the 10 most wanted fugitives list, and investigators believed that he was going to go back to his family in Kentucky. Investigators had his mother Edna speak to him on TV, pleading him to turn himself in. And with all the victims being blondes or redheads like his mother, it made many wonder if these killings had something to do with her. The only strange thing was his mother wasn't the one who abused him. His father did, and his mother kept him safe during this time. Now, it is speculated that possibly he blamed her for not getting out of the situation and further protecting them, but it was by this time the only parent he had left. Unfortunately, this broadcast just made his anger turn towards his family, and he began to say he wasn't sure he wouldn't kill them too. But at least now investigators knew where he was headed and what he planned to do next. And on October 13th, 1995, 4 days after the last murder of Andy Sutton, an officer saw a white Ford Festiva driving down the highway in Kentucky. This was in Waco, and this was the same vehicle that belonged to Tina Marie Cribbs. A police officer began to trail the vehicle for the next 13 miles, and a roadblock was actually set up as well, but that didn't stop him even though they shot at his tire. He kept going, and that is when a sergeant decided to ram him off the road and into a ditch. He was then taken out of his car and arrested, and there wasn't an issue. He didn't seem to have a gun or anything like that. They took him down, and while they were putting in the car, a news reporter who was at the scene began asking him questions, and he told them that if they wanted to ask questions, they had to do it one-on-one in jail. But he began to tell investigators that his number was close to 70, and while investigators didn't want to believe this, they knew it was entirely possible. However, he then recanted it, saying he was only joking and he didn't kill anybody. However, he was in a victim's car that had other victims' belongings in it. And even more victims than they once had were being connected to Glen from other states. Now, Glen would go to trial in Florida for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, and he would be sentenced to death with an execution date of Valentine's Day 1999. Now, his mother wore a tiny little angel pin on her little vest to his trial, and this was because Glen had told her to. Now, it turned out that Nicole Brown Simpson actually collected little tiny angels like this, and he had given this to his mother after her murder. He had also wrote a letter to Clay, and in that letter he said that the angel pin was from the situation in Brentwood where Nicole lived. This was just another thing that made the Rogers family believed he could have killed Nicole. But as far as his sentence for Tina's murder, he appealed this, saying that there wasn't enough evidence and the prosecution was allowed to present an improper argument. This was denied, and then Glen was also found guilty in California for the murder of Sandra Gallagher. He was once again sentenced to death. He showed no remorse for anything he had done, and he also did take the stand at one trial saying he was innocent and yelled out at news reporters that he was innocent in another. But just because he was sentenced didn't mean that this would be the end of collecting information from him about his victims or possible victims. And while he was still awaiting execution in 2009, a criminal profiler named Anthony Milosis started to write him letters. 6 months into doing so, Andy came upon a possible experience that happened to Glen that could have made him who he was. Now, Glen was saying that one day when he was really young, he was going to work with his father. And his father brought a woman to his work and was basically hanging out with her in the other room, and his mother continued to call asking where they were, and he started to lie to her, and that's when she called him a liar and started cussing him out. This woman then came upstairs to do something and was talking to him, saying that he was a good boy, and Glen got really mad, saying that she wasn't his mother. She was a dumb W word. That is when this woman then called his mother a dumb B. And Glen was very angry about this and shoved her down the stairs. At this point, he ran and hid in the closet, and his father then came to tell him he had killed her. His father told him not to tell anyone. They went and buried the body, and Glen said that he believed that he had killed this woman for his mother. Now, who knows if this led him to have a whole bunch of anger towards his mother because he had started killing for her, or if this was anger towards his father for having this woman over and making him do that, or just he decided that he liked killing. But this was a very traumatic experience as a child that could have shaped him into who he was. But this wouldn't be all he would confess in his letters, because Glen began to paint and send these paintings to this criminal profiler to give him clues and confessions. So in these paintings, he would put in little names, little pictures of things that connect to his crimes. And one thing he had wrote were two names, Ron and Nicole. Anthony decided that he needed to talk to Glen in person, face to face, to ask him more about those murders that happened in California. And that is when Glen told him that OJ had hired him to break into Nicole's home and steal some jewelry back that he had bought her that was very expensive. He said that OJ told him he might have to kill her to get it. He said he parked his Ford pickup truck at the entrance of her home, went to grab the spare keys where OJ told him they were, and then went inside the gate. But while he was getting ready to attack, Ron came in and he had to kill him first. And then when Nicole heard this and came down, that is why he killed her there as well. Now, OJ has already been found not guilty of their murders, but found liable for the deaths in a civil lawsuit. Basically, they couldn't charge him with murder since he was found guilty, but they believed he was guilty, and so they made him pay a fine for that. And he was ordered to pay $33.5 million to their families. Now, many believe that OJ is the killer, but hearing this made some wonder, especially the Rogers family, if he was only the mastermind and that Glen was the actual killer who did the dirty work for OJ. Personally, I cannot shake the horrible feeling I get from OJ, and especially when he chose to release a book called If I Did It, talking about how he would have done it and what would have happened if he would have been the killer. That just, to me, is so extremely strange and something only a sociopath or psychopath would do. I mean, I personally haven't read the book, and I don't know if I want to give him money and support him, but I would love to know if I should read it and what you thought about it. But overall, I mean, I can see why the Rogers family believe that Glen could have done this. I mean, he was a serial killer during this time. He was hanging out with Nicole. I just don't know if we can say for certain he had anything to do with it. And I mean, it does make me mad that OJ was never found guilty of these murders. And I think maybe that's why some people want to say that Glen did it, because then he could possibly be found guilty of it, but he is also already serving a death sentence, so it doesn't really matter. In 2019, Linda Price's mother asked the governor of Florida for a execution date because he has still not been executed. And she said it's been 23 years. Her heart is still broken and she just wants justice. But he is still alive today. I know this could possibly be a very controversial thing to be talking about with adding OJ in here, and I don't want any negativity because I just want justice for all of the victims. And, you know, whether it's Glen or OJ, I wish that more was being done for the justice of Nicole and Ron, who were very brutally murdered. But either way, please kindly leave your opinion down below. Anyone who isn't kind or starts attacking people for their own opinions, I will be blocking. So just to let you know that this place is a place for positivity and no negativity. And yeah, so don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.